Hello, and welcome back to Stat 2050 at the University of Wyoming, online, and just having a great old time, I'll tell you what. So, in this video, the first half-ish will kind of be a review from what we did in the last lecture, the last video. And then in the last half, we will be going over some new stuff. New stuff in this idea of sampling. We've talked about it a little bit, but we're going to get a little bit more detail-oriented with it. So, let's get into it. Suppose that a properly chosen sample, big deal, properly chosen, of 1,600 people across the United States, okay, so we have a sample of 1,600 looking at the population of the United States, were asked if they regularly watch a certain TV program. Okay, 24% said yes. How close do you think that percentage is to the whole population, right? Is it within 30%, 10%? Who knows? So, pause the video and think about it. Discuss with your roommate or your friend, or if you live with your parents, your mom, your dad, or whoever, right? Think about it, and then we'll come back and quote-unquote discuss it. Okay. So I assume that you paused the video and had a great conversation with your mom or your dad or your neighbor or whoever about this question. So there's a few things I want to point out that I think are so important, especially for you doing well in this class and then also in real world too. So the first big thing here is we have a sample that's properly chosen. What do we mean by that? Well, if we recall from the last video and the video before that, we have this idea of, good sampling techniques in that we want to make sure that our sample is representative and we want to make sure it's large enough. And then after that, we figure out if we did it observationally or it was an experiment, okay? Which that's something that you just, you're kind of told, right? Okay, so in this case, we can assume, since it says this, properly chosen sample, we can assume that that sample is representative of the population, which in this case is the United States, okay? And we can assume that it's large enough. We have 1,600 people. That's a pretty big number, right? And we'll assume that that number is big enough, okay? So, is that 24%, is that going to be the same? Is that going to be the same in the whole population? Okay, we get into some interesting concepts here. The first thing is that when we work with samples, anytime in statistics we're working with a sample, which is pretty much all the time, right? Not 100% of the time, but pretty much all the time. When we're working with samples, everything that we're calculating, whether that is a mean or a median or, a standard deviation. We'll get into that in a little bit. Or thoughts on some kind of opinion. That's always an estimate. It's always an estimate. Okay? Always an estimate. Working in samples, everything that we calculate is an estimate. We're trying to estimate the actual value of the population. Okay. Oftentimes, the estimate and the actual population value aren't totally the same, but they're nearly the same. So when we say 24% said yes, it's probably close in the whole population. It might be a little bit under 24%. It might be a little bit over 24%. However, we couldn't say any of this. We could not say any of this if, and I'm going to highlight it, this was not said. If that was not said, then we couldn't say, what the heck? We couldn't say anything that we just did, right? We always need a properly chosen sample. That's the key there. Okay. Also, I've put these shows, well-known shows, here in order of how good they are. So Breaking Bad is so good. And then, close second, Blue's Clues. And then Far Away in the third is the specifically the last season of Game of Thrones. That's fine, though. It's fine. That was like 2 years ago. All right, moving on. Food for thought again. Suppose you... Let's see. Yeah, suppose you had a telephone book of all the businesses in the city you live in Laramie, for instance. And everything was done alphabetically, as they are in phone books. If you wanted to call 100 of these businesses to get their opinion on something, how would you select those 100 businesses? Well, there's many ways we could go about doing this, and we have so many different sampling methods to go about doing this. In fact, here at the University of Wyoming, we have a whole class on sampling, which is crazy. We'll only be going over just a few different types, but just know that there's so many different ways we can do this idea of sampling. But let's talk about a big flaw that often happens in sampling. We have this idea that, well, it might not be the best to get the most convenient, right? Where the most convenient would be opening up the phone book to the first page and just getting all the ones that start with A, right? More often than not, you'll probably just get like automotive sales and people who sell ants or something like that, right? Not totally representative, especially if you're trying to get an idea of all business owners, right? All business owners in your city. If you were just to get the first 100 that start with A or the first 100 in the phone book, probably not going to get a totally good representative sample. Okay, that's all right. That's good. So what are some common research strategies? Okay, well, we've talked about this a ton before, and it's especially applicable to those of you who are in social sciences, psychology, etc., etc. We have this idea of a sample survey. A sample. Pretty cool, pretty easy. It can take the form of a poll. It can take the form of open-ended questions, closed questions. It involves asking a group of people, usually more than one question. Typically, that's the goal, at least to get kind of a wide swath of opinions. Hopefully, you've sampled well enough to get a representative of the population as a whole, as far as opinion goes. So we're looking more in that categorical, kind of qualitative variable side of things, rather than measuring, some continuous variable. Also, ideally, you're not doing any kind of intervention or manipulation, right? So you're not doing any sort of, experiment on the group as you give them a survey, right? You're just saying, okay, here you are, take the survey, and then that's that. Okay. All right. On the opposite end, for people who are in the more basic sciences and psychology included, we have this idea of a randomized experiment. Okay, so breaking it down, an experiment is just something that measures the effect of, whatever you're measuring, if that kind of makes sense. Measuring the effect of manipulating the environment in some way, right? So you have some group or two groups or whatever, and you do something to one of the groups. The first thing that comes to my mind, you've got two groups. One of them you don't do anything to, and then the other group, you give them some sort of workout plan to work out for like a month or two. And then after that, you see how much their muscle density changes, or how much they can bench, their max bench or their max squat or something like that, right? That's known as an experiment. And then a randomized experiment is the manipulation, right? So I've got two groups. One of them I'm doing something to, right? Picking which people I put into the manipulated group is totally random, okay? Totally random. And the good thing about this the great thing about experiments, specifically experiments, and not observational things, is that they can suggest a cause and effect. Recall that when we were working with the observational, we could make a casual conclusion. We could casually say that we saw this, right? But when you have a randomized experiment, you are able to control for more variability, and you're more able to suggest that what you did, whatever manipulation you did, was the cause for the effect. Okay. Still suggesting, not totally proving. Let me write this off too, because this is important. Suggesting does not equal prove. Does not. Very important. We're only suggesting things. We're not saying that, hey, I finally proved this. Only suggesting. All right. Observational studies. We've talked about this a lot. I will let you read this on your own. But the big advantage here that I want you to take home is that you observe the world as it naturally occurs. Okay? So you're not doing anything to change the world as it is. You're just letting people live, and and then you're just seeing what happens. Okay. So those are sort of the 2 or 3 most common ways to get data. Some other common ways of getting data and making conclusions. You have this idea of meta-analysis. And what that is pretty much you let all researchers do all the hard work, and then you go in and you find all of the studies that are similar to each other, and then you compare the conclusions of each of those studies, all related to right around the same thing, and then you're able to maybe see some trends in those outcomes. Pretty interesting. Can get kind of complicated. We won't do anything. We're not going to be doing anything like this in this class. And then you have another pretty commonly seen, at least it's sort of like sensationalized in the news, but you have this idea of case studies where you look at one person or a small group of people with, for instance, some kind of disease, right? Or some sort of condition that is super rare. And you just try to get as much information about that person and about that condition as you can, right? And that's pretty much that. It's more or less used as sort of suggesting rather than saying, again, proving anything. And it's sort of complicated because the stuff that you see in this is, as far as results and as far as conclusions go, whatever you see in a case study has happened. But the big thing here is you only have one or like a small number of people involved. Oftentimes, a sample size of 1 is not really large enough. So this is more of, just something that gets put out there that is maybe referenced here and there, but is never used as the basis for, like a brand new hypothesis or something like that, most of the time. Okay. Types of research variables. Now, if you recall from 1 or 2 videos ago, I said that there are 2 big types of variables. That's true. We have the quantitative, and then we have the qualitative, right? So a bunch of numbers and then categorical variables. Those are more or less sort of the adjectives that we use to describe variables, right? Or types of data. But in research, we are able to further split those 2 types of variables up into, different groups, okay? So let me sort of explain what I'm talking about here. In research, typically, in designing research, we've got these 2 variables. The first one being, predictor variables. Now, oftentimes, gosh, I hate it so much too, but oftentimes in like textbooks and like out in, wherever the internet, you'll see the predictor variable also be referred to as the independent variable. I hate that so much. I think that predictor makes a little bit more sense. It's become using this word here is becoming more common anyway. And then we've got down here, we have the outcome variable. And I'll chat about this in just a second. But that's also referred to as the dependent variable or the response variable. Okay. So the predictor variable, that is the thing that the researcher is manipulating. Okay. So you can have two groups or whatever, and then this group gets, some manipulation done to it. That could be, some kind of treatment. It could be some kind of treatment. That could be some kind of intervention. Whatever. It could be so many other things, right? But it's something that is happening to this group, right? Something that you are controlling, right? Okay. And then on the opposite end, you have the outcome, which is the thing that you are measuring, right? So going back to this example over here, you might be doing, some kind of workout regimen for a month or two. And you are measuring, let's say, muscle density at the end of it, right? That is your outcome variable, the thing that you care to measure, right? So you have the predictor, something that you manipulate, all right, or something that you think can predict the outcome, which in this case would be like muscle density, just as an example. Okay, let's get some more common language defined. I've been using it a lot, and I'm sure that you caught on. But we have this idea in sampling. We have this idea of units, population, and then the actual sample. Okay. So the unit is the person or the animal or the location or the chemical or whatever that you are measuring, and then that's that. That is your unit. Okay. Within, let's see, and then a bunch of units make up a population. Okay. And more specifically, it's the complete set of units that you are studying, that you care to study. Oftentimes, it's easiest to think about this in like literal population, so like city population, the amount of people in that city or the amount of people in that country or whatever. But you can also kind of break that down into more specific groups. So you could think of it as like young adults in the U.S., right? Or people in a certain income bracket in the U.S., right? Or in some other country. You do still have to be, pretty specific with what you are, measuring, what population. You can't be like super general. But it is typically, right, a bunch of units making up, a big collective group. Okay. And then you can break that population down into samples, which in statistics is pretty much the basis, right? You have the whole population. Oftentimes, it's either too expensive to sample the whole population, or it's just impossible, right? In the U.S. specifically, we have the census, which is an attempt to sample the whole population, but oftentimes people either don't answer the census, or the census is not even shipped out to them because they don't have an address, or their address is changed, etc., etc. Many reasons, right? But that's like one of the closest things that you can get to measuring the whole population. Okay. Anyway, subset or a sample is just a subset of the population, and we can kind of see that here, right? Where we've got these, let's see, 5 people, and then you bring them in over here. I guess that one too. You bring them in over here, and that's your sample. And ideally, you want something that is representative of the whole population and is large enough, right? Okay, so that's all fine. Let's talk more about sampling, but let's do it in another video. Go take a break, go bake some bread or sip some coffee, listen to an album or whatever, and take it easy just for a little bit. And I'll see you here in just a second.